On a Tuesday morning in late October of 1987, Dale Murchison stood at the edge of a collapsed embankment on the east side of Harlan County, Kentucky, and watched a $180,000 front-end loader sink another 6 inches into the mud. He had been watching it sink for 11 days. His crew had been watching it sink for 11 days, and every morning when Dale drove out from town on Route 119, he told himself that today would be the day they got it out, and every evening when he drove back, the loader was still there, still sinking, still costing him money he didn't have and a job he couldn't afford to lose. Let me tell you about Dale Murchison because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did and what it cost him. Dale was 44 years old in 1987, and he had built Murchison Grading and Excavation out of a single used bulldozer he bought in 1968 with $4,200 he had saved working summers at the coal tipple outside of Cumberland. By 1987, he had 7 pieces of equipment, 12 employees, and a reputation in 3 counties as the man you called when the ground was difficult. He had graded the access road for the new hospital in Harlan. He had cut the drainage channels for the Benham Industrial Park. He had moved more earth in eastern Kentucky than most men twice his age, and he had done it by being methodical, careful, and absolutely certain that he understood every piece of ground before he put a machine on it. That certainty was the thing that had made him successful. And it was the thing that was killing him now, or because the ground on the east side of the Clover Fork project had made a fool of him, and Dale Murchison did not know how to be a fool. The job itself had seemed straightforward. The state had contracted Murchison Grading to cut a new drainage channel along the east bank of Clover Fork Creek, a project that would redirect runoff from the newly widened section of Route 119 and prevent the chronic flooding that had been swallowing the road shoulder every spring for a decade. The channel was 800 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 8 feet deep, and Dale had bid it at $340,000, which was tight but manageable if the ground cooperated. The ground did not cooperate. What the soil survey had called firm alluvial clay turned out to be, once you got 18 inches below the surface, something closer to wet concrete mixed with river gravel and old mine tailings, a combination that had no business being where it was, and that ate through cutting edges and hydraulic lines like they were made of paper. By the end of the first week, Dale had blown 2 hydraulic hoses on his Cat 950 loader and cracked a cutting edge on his 977 track loader. By the end of the second week, the 950 had gone in. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way things go in when the ground underneath them is not what it appears to be. Gradually, stubbornly, with a kind of slow inevitability that is worse than a sudden catastrophe because it gives you time to understand exactly how bad the situation is. The loader had drifted off the edge of the work platform Dale's crew had built, caught the right rear corner in a seam of saturated material, and settled. And then it settled more. And then it was in up to the axles, and then up to the belly. And then it stopped sinking with the cab still above the mudline, but the machine itself buried to a depth that made Dale's stomach hurt to look at. He had tried everything. He had brought in his D6 dozer and rigged a pulling chain, and the chain had snapped at 40,000 pounds of pull and put a dent in the dozer's blade that cost him $800 to straighten. He had called a recovery company out of Lexington, and they had come with a 25-ton wrecker and spent 2 days rigging and pulling before their operator told Dale, with genuine regret, that the suction on the machine was too great, and they were going to tear it apart before they pulled it out. He had called the cat dealer in Harlan, and the dealer had sent a field rep who walked around the machine with his hands in his pockets and told Dale that, in his professional opinion, the machine was a write-off, that the cost of extraction and repair would exceed the machine's value, and that Dale should contact his insurance company. The field rep had driven away in a clean pickup truck, and Dale had stood in the mud and thought about the $180,000 he still owed on the loader's note, and about the $4,200 he had saved working summers at the coal tipple, and about the distance between those two numbers and what it had taken to travel in it. Let me tell you about what those 11 days cost, because the numbers matter. Every day the loader sat in that mud, Dale was paying his crew to work around it and losing the productivity of his most capable machine. The recovery company had charged him $4,800 for 2 days of failed effort. The replacement hydraulic hoses on the 977 had run $1,200. The delay had pushed the project 2 weeks behind schedule, which triggered a penalty clause in his state contract of $500 per day. He was already at $11,000 in penalties and climbing. The total damage, if the machine was a write-off, was somewhere north of $200,000 when you counted the note balance, the lost productivity, the penalties, and the repair costs on the other equipment. Dale had built his company over 19 years, and it was possible that 11 days in a muddy creek bank in Harlan County were going to take it apart. That was the morning of November 3rd. That was the morning Alton Burchett drove down off the ridge in a 1917 couple-gear freight wheel truck with a winch body on it, and everything changed. Let me tell you about Alton Burchett, because you need to understand the man. Alton was 79 years old in 1987, and he had farmed the same 280 acres on the ridge above Clover Fork his entire life. His grandfather had homesteaded that land in 1891. His father had nearly lost it in 1932 and hadn't, and Alton had worked it since he was old enough to drive a team. He was a small man, thin in the way that men who have worked outdoors their whole lives get thin, not frail, but reduced to essentials, the way a good tool gets worn down to its working edge. He had white hair under a feed store cap and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same material as the ridge he lived on. He didn't talk much. He had never talked much. His wife Edna had told people for 50 years that Alton said more with a look than most men said in an hour, and she was right. Alton had watched the whole 11 days from the ridge. His farm ran down to within 400 yards of the work site, and he had a clear view of the creek bank from his equipment shed, and he had watched the recovery company come and go, and he had watched the cat dealer's field rep walk around with his hands in his pockets, and he had watched Dale Murchison stand in the mud every morning and look at his buried machine with the expression of a man who has run out of ideas. Alton had known what needed to be done since about the third day. He had not said anything, because it was not his job, and because nobody had asked him, and because in his experience, as men who have convinced themselves that expensive equipment is the answer to every problem are not ready to hear about a different kind of answer until they have completely exhausted the expensive equipment. So he had waited. He had been patient. He had watched from the ridge. Let me tell you about the truck, because the truck is as important as any person in this story. The 1917 couple-gear freight wheel was not, technically, a truck in the way most people understand the word. It was a motorized freight hauler built by the Couple-Gear Freight Wheel Company of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and it operated on a principle that most people in 1917 already found unusual, and that most people in 1987 found incomprehensible. Each wheel was driven by its own individual electric motor, powered by a gasoline engine that ran a generator rather than a drivetrain. There was no transmission, no differential, no drive shaft. Each wheel simply turned at whatever speed the motor driving it required, which meant the machine had traction control that was 70 years ahead of its time, and which meant it could put power to the ground with a steadiness and precision that no conventional drivetrain of its era or most eras since could match. Alton's grandfather had bought the truck in 1919 from a mining company that was liquidating its equipment, and had paid $340 for it, and had used it to haul timber off the ridge for 30 years. Alton's father had kept it running through the Depression by machining replacement parts himself on a lathe he had bought from a closed-down machine shop in Harlan. Alton had rebuilt the generator twice, or rewound 2 of the wheel motors, and replaced every inch of wiring in the machine at some point in the past 40 years. He knew every bolt on it. He knew every sound it made and what each sound meant. The winch body on the back had been added by his father in 1938, a heavy-duty drum winch rated at 30,000 pounds of line pull, driven by a power takeoff from the generator. The cable on the drum was 3/4-inch steel wire rope, 300 feet of it, and it had been inspected and partially replaced in 1981 when Alton had found 3 feet of fraying near the drum end. The truck came down off the ridge road at about 8 in the morning, and the sound of it preceded it by a full 2 minutes. A deep, even chuffing from the gasoline engine, nothing like the diesel roar of modern construction equipment, more like the sound of something breathing steadily and without hurry. Dale Murchison heard it before he saw it, and he turned toward the ridge road with the expression of a man who has been interrupted in the middle of a bad dream. Then the truck came around the bend in the road, and Dale stood very still and looked at it, and his foreman, a man named Roy Combs, who had been with Dale for 14 years, looked at it, and 2 of the equipment operators looked at it, and for a moment nobody said anything. The truck was enormous. That was the first thing. People who knew the couple gear by reputation thought of it as an antique, a curiosity, something from a photograph. In person, it was enormous, high-wheeled, wide-tracked, with a flat-nosed cab that sat over the front axle, and a winch body behind it that was built from steel plate that had been painted black so many times the paint had its own topography. The machine moved with a steadiness that was almost unsettling, each wheel turning independently, the whole machine tracking perfectly on the uneven road without the lurching and corrections of a conventional drive train. Alton Burchett sat in the cab in his feed store cap and his Carhartt jacket and his expression of a man who has nowhere particular to be. Roy Combs said something under his breath that Dale didn't catch, and then Dale said, "What in the world is that?" And Roy said, "I believe that's Alton Burchett from up on the ridge." And Dale said, "I know who Alton Burchett is. I mean, what is he driving?" And Roy said, "I genuinely have no idea." Alton pulled the truck to a stop at the edge of the work area and climbed down from the cab. He walked over to where Dale was standing and looked at the buried loader for a moment without saying anything. Then he looked at Dale. He said, "I've been watching you work on that for about a week and a half." Dale said yes. Alton said, "You tried pulling it straight out." Dale said yes, twice, and it didn't move. Alton nodded. He said, "You're pulling against the suction. You need to break the suction first, and then pull." He said it the way you'd say something that was obvious, not unkindly, just plainly. Dale looked at him. He said, "The recovery company said the suction was the problem and they couldn't break it without tearing the machine apart." Alton said they were pulling too hard and too fast. You break suction with a steady pull at an angle, not a straight yank. He said, that truck can put 30,000 pounds of steady tension on a cable and hold it there for as long as it takes. Your modern equipment can spike higher than that, but it can't hold it steady because the hydraulics cycle. Mine doesn't cycle, it just pulls. Dale looked at the truck. He looked at Alton. He looked at Roy, who shrugged, and then Dale Murchison, who had built his company on the certainty that he understood equipment and ground and the relationship between them, did something that cost him something. He laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, or not entirely, but it was the laugh of a man who has been through 11 days of failure and is now being offered salvation by a 79-year-old farmer in a truck that was built when Woodrow Wilson was president, and the laugh came out before he could stop it. He said, Alton, I appreciate you coming down. I genuinely do, but that thing is 70 years old. My recovery company had a 25-ton wrecker and couldn't move it. What is that truck going to do that a 25-ton wrecker couldn't? Alton looked at him. He said, a 25-ton wrecker pulls with a hydraulic cylinder that has a stroke of maybe 36 inches and then has to reset. Mine pulls with a cable drum that will turn until the cable runs out. There's a difference between a punch and a steady push. Then he said, you want to keep standing here, or you want your machine back? Roy Combs made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Dale looked at the buried loader for a long moment. He said, fine, but when it doesn't work, I don't want to hear about it. Alton said, you won't, and walked back to his truck. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a man work who was completely without doubt? Not arrogance, not performance, not the false certainty of someone who is trying to convince themselves, but genuine, settled, untroubled competence. It is one of the strangest and most calming things you will ever see, because it is so rare. Most of us, when we undertake something difficult, carry the weight of the possibility of failure with us. We move faster than we should, or we second-guess the setup, or we look around to see if anyone is watching. Alton Burchett moved the way water moves, finding the right path without effort, without hurry, without any visible awareness that there was any other way to do what he was doing. He spent 45 minutes on the setup. 45 minutes. While Dale's crew stood around with their hands in their pockets, and Roy Combs checked his watch twice, and Dale himself walked away to the far side of the work area so he wouldn't have to watch. Alton walked the perimeter of the mud pit first, studying the angle of the buried machine, the direction of the embankment, the location of the nearest solid ground. He walked it twice. Then he drove the couple gear around to the uphill side of the site, where the ground was firm, and he positioned the truck at an angle of about 30 degrees off the machine's center line, and he set the rear stabilizer plates, which were wide steel pads on hinged arms that folded down from the frame and bit into the ground, and he spent 15 minutes making sure they were fully engaged. Then he walked the cable out himself, 180 feet of it, and rigged it to the loader's front axle housing with a shackle that he produced from a wooden box in the truck bed. He checked the shackle pin 3 times. He checked the cable where it passed over the drum lip and where it ran along the ground. He did all of this without rushing and without speaking to anyone. Roy Combs drifted over to where Dale was standing and said, "You know, that rigging looks right." Dale said, "Don't." Roy said, "I'm just saying, the angle he's set up, he's not trying to pull it straight out. He's trying to roll it onto its side first, break the suction along the edge. That's actually the right approach." Dale said, "Roy, please don't tell me the 79-year-old man with the antique truck is using the right approach." Roy said, "Okay," and they stood there in silence. Alton climbed back into the cab. The gasoline engine, which had been idling this whole time with its steady, untroubled chuffing, deepened slightly as he engaged the generator load. The winch drum began to turn. The cable, which had been lying slack and dark in the mud, began to tighten. It came up off the ground in sections, first near the truck, then progressively toward the loader, the mud falling from it in clumps as the tension came on. And then the cable was taut, and for a long moment nothing seemed to happen. The crew had drifted in without realizing it. All 6 of them were standing within 30 feet of the mud pit, watching. Roy Combs had his arms crossed. Dale had come back from the far side of the work area and was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets. Nobody was talking. The cable hummed. It was a low, steady sound, not the groaning of something about to fail, but the sound of something working at the edge of its design load and finding that load manageable. The drum turned at maybe 2 revolutions per minute. The tension on the cable was not a spike, not a jerk, not the hydraulic surge of a conventional winch. It was a steady, unrelenting, patient pull, the kind of pull that does not announce itself but simply continues and continues and continues. An inch, maybe 2. The loader shifted at the right front corner, a small rotation, barely visible, and one of the operators said something quiet, and the man next to him grabbed his arm. The mud at the machine's edge cracked slightly, a dark line opening in the surface, and then there was a sound from underneath. Not loud, more felt than heard. A deep subsonic groan that traveled through the ground and up through the soles of everyone's boots. Alton held the tension. The drum kept turning. The cable kept humming. Then the suction broke. It broke with a sound like a gunshot muffled by water, a deep concussive thump that sent a shiver across the surface of the mud pit, and the loader moved. Not dramatically, not all at once, but it moved, rolling onto its angled side, the right front corner coming up out of the mud while the left rear corner dug in briefly and then released, and the machine came up and out of the hole it had made for itself over 11 days, trailing mud and water and the smell of disturbed earth, and it came to rest on the firm ground at the edge of the pit, with a sound like a very large, very tired thing setting itself down. Roy Combs said Jesus Christ very quietly. One of the operators started clapping, and then 2 more joined him, and then all 6 of the crew were cheering, the sound of it carrying up the creek bank and echoing off the ridge. Dale Murchison stood absolutely still. His arms were at his sides. His face had gone a color that Roy would describe later as the color of old concrete. Not pale exactly, but drained, flattened, like the blood had been redistributed somewhere else for reasons of emergency. He looked at the loader, which was out of the mud and intact and, as far as anyone could tell at a distance, not materially damaged. He looked at the couple gear, which sat on the firm ground with its stabilizers down and its drum still and its engine chuffing with the same steady patience it had maintained throughout. He looked at Alton Burchett, who had climbed down from the cab and was walking the cable back toward the loader, coiling it as he went, not looking at the crew or at Dale or at anything except the cable in his hands. The whole pull had taken 22 minutes. 22 minutes after 11 days. Dale walked over to where Alton was coiling cable and stood next to him for a moment. He said, "I owe you an apology." Alton said, "No, you don't." Dale said, "I laughed at you." Alton said, "Men laugh at things they don't understand." "It doesn't mean anything." He kept coiling cable. Dale said, "How did you know the angle would break the suction?" Alton said, "Because suction is just atmospheric pressure on a sealed surface. You break the seal, you break the suction." A straight pull tries to overcome the pressure. An angled pull tries to break the seal at one edge first, and once one edge is open, the rest comes easy. He said, "It's the same principle as opening a jar. You don't pull the lid straight off. You break the seal at one point first." Dale stood there and looked at him. He said, "Why didn't you come down sooner?" Alton said, "Because you weren't ready to listen sooner." He said it without any particular emphasis, just as a statement of observable fact, and then he went back to coiling his cable. Dale asked what he owed him. Alton said nothing, that he was a neighbor, and neighbors help each other. Dale told him he was not going to accept that, and after some discussion, Alton agreed to let Dale make a donation to the Clover Fork Volunteer Fire Department in whatever amount Dale thought was appropriate. Dale wrote a check for $2,000 that afternoon. It was, he said later, the best $2,000 he ever spent, and the cheapest lesson he ever bought. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end at the creek bank. The Cat 950 loader, once it had been cleaned and inspected, turned out to have sustained only minor damage. 2 bent hydraulic lines and a cracked front axle seal. Total repair cost $3,400. It was back in service in 4 days. The Clover Fork drainage project was completed 6 weeks later, and while Dale ate the penalty costs already accrued, the state inspector, who had heard the story of the extraction from someone at the county road department, quietly declined to assess any further penalties for the remaining delay. The project came in at a loss, but a survivable loss, and Murchison Grading survived. Dale Murchison drove up to Alton Burchett's farm the following spring, the first week of May, when the ridge was green and the air smelled like wet earth and new growth. He brought a case of bourbon and a handshake, and he sat on Alton's porch for 2 hours and listened to the old man talk about the couple gear, about how his grandfather had found it at the mining company liquidation, about how his father had machined the replacement parts during the Depression, about the wheel motor rewindings and the generator rebuilds and the 1981 cable replacement. He listened the way a man listens when he understands that he is in the presence of something he almost didn't get to hear. Before he left, he asked Alton if he had ever considered what would happen to the truck when he was gone. Alton said his son Gerald had been helping him maintain it since he was 12 years old and knew it as well as Alton did. Dale said that was good. Alton said, "Some things are worth keeping." Dale said, "Yes, they are." And he drove back down the ridge road thinking about all the things he had dismissed as obsolete and what that dismissal had cost him. Let me tell you about Alton Burchett's last years because they matter. He kept farming until he was 84, and he kept the couple gear running until the end. He died in the winter of 1992, and they buried him in the cemetery at the Clover Fork Baptist Church on a Thursday in January, and Dale Murchison was there, and Roy Combs was there, and 6 members of the Clover Fork Volunteer Fire Department were there in their dress uniforms because of the donation Dale had made in Alton's name. Gerald Burchett, who was 52 by then, stood at the graveside in his father's feed store cap, which he had put on that morning without thinking about it, and then left on because it seemed right. The couple gear sat in the equipment shed on the ridge. Gerald had started it the morning of the funeral to make sure it was running. The way his father had always said, you should run an engine regularly or it forgets what it's for. Now, let me tell you about the morning of September 14th, 2009, because the story doesn't end with Alton Burchett in the ground. A construction company out of Pikeville had a problem on a site 3 miles from the old Clover Fork project. They were grading a hillside for a natural gas pipeline right of way, and they had put a Komatsu WA 500 wheel loader into a wet seam on the downhill side of the cut, and the machine had gone in hard, cab height, fully buried on the left side. There's the right side still partially visible, but the machine not moving and the ground around it still actively saturated from 3 weeks of September rain. The company had tried their own equipment, a D8 dozer that had gotten close enough to the edge to make the foreman nervous before they pulled it back. They had called a heavy recovery company from Lexington, the same one Dale Murchison had called in 1987, and the recovery company had looked at the machine and told the site foreman, a young man named Travis Hale, who was 31 years old and had never lost a machine before, that the suction was too great for a direct pull and that the machine was likely a write-off. Travis Hale was standing at the edge of the mud pit with his hands in his pockets when a 1917 couple-gear freight wheel truck came down the county road and pulled up to the site entrance. Gerald Burchett was driving. He was 69 years old, and he had his father's feed store cap on, and he had the same expression his father had always had, which was the expression of a man who has nowhere particular to be. Travis looked at the truck. He looked at Gerald. He said, "What in the world is that?" One of his operators, a man from Harlan County who was old enough to know the story, said, "Son, you need to let that man do what he came to do, and then you need to say thank you." Gerald walked the site the same way his father had walked it. Twice around the perimeter, studying the angle of the buried machine, the direction of the embankment, while the location of the firm ground. He positioned the couple gear on the uphill side at an angle of about 30 degrees off the machine's center line. He set the stabilizer plates. He walked the cable out himself and rigged it to the Komatsu's front axle housing. He checked the shackle pin 3 times. Travis Hale stood with his arms crossed and said to his foreman, "This is not going to work." His foreman, who was 58 and had spent his whole career in eastern Kentucky and had heard the story of the Clover Fork extraction from his own father, said, "Travis, put your arms down and watch." The gasoline engine deepened. The drum turned. The cable came up out of the mud. The tension came on, steady and unrelenting and patient, and for a long moment nothing seemed to happen. And then the suction broke with that deep, muffled, concussive thump, and the Komatsu came up and out and came to rest on the firm ground at the edge of the pit. Travis Hale's arms dropped to his sides. He stood very still for a moment. Then he walked over to where Gerald was coiling cable and said, "How did you know the angle would break the suction?" And Gerald Burchett looked at him and said, "Because suction is just atmospheric pressure on a sealed surface. You break the seal, you break the suction. It's the same principle as opening a jar. You don't pull the lid straight off. You break the seal at one point first." He said it the way his father had said it, plainly, without any particular emphasis, as a statement of observable fact. Travis asked what he owed him. Gerald said nothing, that he was a neighbor and neighbors help each other. Travis said he was not going to accept that. Gerald said, "There's a volunteer fire department in Clover Fork." Travis wrote a check for $2,000 that afternoon. He did not know, until someone told him later, that a man named Dale Murchison had written the same check to the same fire department for the same reason 22 years before. The couple gear freight wheel truck sits in the equipment shed on the ridge above Clover Fork today. Gerald's son, David, who is 44 years old and has been helping maintain the truck since he was old enough to reach the wheel motors, keeps the engine running and the cable inspected and the wheel motor brushes clean. Engineers from the University of Kentucky's Mechanical Engineering Department have come up to look at it twice in the past 15 years. And both times they have left shaking their heads at the elegance of the individual wheel drive system and the durability of a machine that has been in continuous service for over 100 years. They have offered to write papers about it. David Burchett has said they're welcome to write whatever they want, but the truck stays on the ridge. The Clover Fork Volunteer Fire Department has received anonymous donations in the amount of $2,000 every 3 or 4 years for the past 3 decades. Nobody at the fire department knows for certain where the money comes from, though the chief has his suspicions. Let me tell you one last thing, because it is the thing that matters most about this story. Dale Murchison retired in 2001, and before he did, he called every young equipment operator and foreman who had ever worked for him into his office, one at a time, and told them the story of the couple gear and the buried loader and the 79-year-old farmer who had come down off the ridge with the answer that 3 professional recovery operations hadn't found. He told it the same way every time. He told them about the 11 days and the failed pulls and the cat dealer's field rep with his hands in his pockets. He told them about Alton Burchett's arrival and the sound the old engine made coming down the ridge road. He told them about the laugh, his own laugh, and what it had cost him, and what it had revealed about the assumptions he had been carrying without knowing it. And he told them what Alton had said when he asked why he hadn't come down sooner. Because you weren't ready to listen sooner. And he told them that in his opinion, those were the most important words anyone had ever said to him in his professional life. He told them that the ground doesn't care what your equipment cost. He told them that suction is just atmospheric pressure on a sealed surface, and that understanding a problem is different from having the power to overcome it, and that those 2 things are not the same and never will be. He told them that the most dangerous thing in this business is not a bad piece of ground or a buried machine or a blown hydraulic line. The most dangerous thing is the certainty that you already know the answer, because that certainty is the thing that keeps you from hearing the man who is standing at the edge of your mud pit with the right one. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were,